is Rob Spillman. I'm the chair of the curatorial committee, and on behalf of the 5,000 members of PEN, I want to welcome you. And I want to thank all of our volunteers and partners who have put this, helped put this amazing festival together, including our partner, the New York Women's Foundation, which has been instrumental with this this panel. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate Landon, who's going to take it away. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you who joined us today. My name is Kate Landon. I'm a director of programs at the New York Women's Foundation. For those of you who may not know us, we are one of over 100 women's funds throughout the world, and we are focused here on the 5 boroughs of New York City with a mission to empower and support women and families in the 5 boroughs towards long-term economic security and justice. If you'd like to learn more about us, you can check out our website, nywf.org, or feel free to come and approach me after this is over and I can talk to you more about our work. We are very excited to be here in this very important conversation today. Issues of criminal justice reform and the incarceration of women have been some that have been very important to us over our 30 years. And I think we can all agree, and the reason why we have this topic today is I think a lot of us have noticed sort of an increase in media and public discourse on issues of mass incarceration, criminal justice reform, both nationally and locally over the past couple of years, whether it's police brutality and the response by organizers and activists throughout the country through the social media campaign Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, the topic of the privatization of the prison industry, which there was a great event here a couple hours earlier in the same room about that, or even locally, the work of courageous activists to really push the city to think bigger and bolder about what to do with Rikers Island and the plans for that facility on that island, and to reimagine what can be done with that public space for common good. I think one of the sets of voices that are too often left out of the conversation are those of women. I think still when we think about these issues, we primarily think about men and think less about the women, either as partners and family members of men who are incarcerated or as individuals who may be incarcerated themselves. All of the data, however, that has come out from, or a lot of the data that's come out from recent research, as well as when we speak to women who have experience with the criminal justice system, tell us that we need to be looking closer. And so I really appreciated the description for the event that was today, because it highlighted some of those facts. You know, we all know that the United States has the highest incarceration rate of its citizens in the world. But a lot of people don't know that within the prison population, for example, the growth of women since 1980 in the prison population has increased 50% higher than men. When we look at the jail system, which is separate from the prison system, but has much overlap with the prison system, as recently as 1970, I believe there were 3/4 of all county jails in the country had not one woman in any given year. Since 1970, while the jail population of men has increased 5 times over, the jail population of women has increased 14 times over. So we're here today to talk about these issues and ask some of these important questions. Why is this happening? Why has it happened? What are the implications on women's lives, on the lives of their family members, on the lives of their communities, and what are the implications for all of us? So you're very much in luck because we have a fabulous panel who live and breathe these issues every day and are here to explore some of these topics with us today. So I'll just do very brief intros. I have to my left Christine Pahigian, Executive Director of Friends of Island Academy, who's been an advocate particularly around juvenile and criminal justice reform at the direct service policy and government levels for 30 years. We have Piper Kerman, author of the memoir, Orange is the New Black, My Year in a Woman's Prison, as well as a board member of the Women's Prison Association and other local activist organizations like Just Leadership USA, who has been one of those lead organizers around shutting down Rikers, for example. We have Asale Angel-Ajani, Director of Women's Studies and a professor at City College of New York, and who has written and reported on the impact of incarceration and drug trafficking on the lives of women in Europe, West Africa, and Asia over the past 15 years. And also Reverend Vivian Nixon, Executive Director of College and Community Fellowship, an organization committed to removing individual and structural barriers to higher education for women with criminal histories and their families. So thank you all for joining us. Just a little bit about the format. We will have about 45 minutes of conversation today. but we certainly want to hear from everyone in the audience. So we'll plan to have about 25, 30 minutes of Q&A from you all with the audience, because I believe we're all really interested in learning and hearing from you too. So let's just open it up a bit. I'd love to hear from all of you on this opening question. Let's just talk and dive a little bit more why it's really important for us to have conversations like this on topics of women in incarceration, separate from incarceration more generally. And if you could speak a little bit from your own experiences, work, professional, otherwise, current or past, as to what you see as sort of different about drivers of women to the system and needs of women who are in the system and once they leave. So, who'd like to start?
I'll jump in. This is all good. I'm Vivian, and it's nice to see you all here. Thank you for joining us for this conversation, and thank you, of course, to the New York Women's Foundation for making this conversation available to the public and to the Pan America Festival. So when I think about this issue, although I think about it through a gender lens, I think about the expansion of incarceration over the last 3 decades, impacting women, certain women, from the very start. Even before we saw the uptick in actual women's incarceration, women in poor families, women in African American families in urban areas were experiencing the devastating impact of mass incarceration as their sons and husbands and partners, nephews, and community members were sent away for really extreme sentences, devastating local communities, taking resources out of those communities and leaving women to kind of fend for themselves, basically. Elizabeth Hinton has written a wonderful book that really connects the line between the exacerbated levels of poverty in those communities due to mass incarceration and the uptick in women's incarceration. Lots of women go into illegal activity as a way to sustain themselves and their families. And there's also a lot of data showing a direct pipeline from early childhood abuse into prison, substance abuse, all of these reasons that are really public health concerns and not criminal justice concerns are driving the increased incarceration of women. And I'm really anxious to get to the part of the conversation where we talk about, like, how do we fix this? Because I think we're approaching it the wrong way, because the system is punitive and does not really do anything to increase public health. I think we need to start talking about this as a public health issue and not a criminal justice issue. But those are some of the drivers that I've noticed in my work at college and community fellowship.
Would you like to go next?
Let's see. Is this thing on? Yeah. Vivian is spot on, as always. We know exactly what the main drivers of women's involvement in crime or community disorder is and what might result in their incarceration. Those are 3 really consistent factors. Those are the overwhelming incidents of survival of trauma, sexual assault, other kinds of physical assaults, sometimes early in childhood, sometimes throughout a woman's entire life prior to incarceration. Not unrelated, we see high incidences of substance use disorder, and we see high incidences of mental health problems and sometimes full-blown mental illness. So we know exactly why women or girls end up in the system, right? And we also know that prisons and jails are incredibly poor places to address those issues. That's true for men as well, and we see higher incidences than in the general population on all those fronts. But when we look at women and girls, you know, it's just sky high on all of those fronts. So when we think about the history that both of you have touched upon, and when we think about how we have dealt with mental health issues in this country, the deinstitutionalization of people in the 1970s, which was the right thing to do, but we didn't then continue to do the right thing in terms of providing care in the community. You know, the changing needs and necessities around substance use disorder and addiction. And the woeful failing of the criminal justice system itself to respond appropriately to things like sexual assault, to things like, neglect of children. We see all those things playing out, and our response has been to banish those problems. In the words of Angela Davis, prisons don't solve problems, they only hide them. I think about, as someone who has been incarcerated, like Reverend Nixon, I think about these things in extremely literal terms. I think about them in terms of the women that I did time with, who are incredibly important people to me. And I think about them, I still go into prison almost every week. I teach nonfiction writing. And one of my classes is in a men's medium security state prison. And one of my classes is in the primary women's prison in Ohio. And I think about my students, and they're incredibly important people. They're incredibly fascinating. They are brave, they are resilient, they have a ton of strengths. And there's next to nothing about the way that our correctional systems work to help folks recognize what their strengths are in the first place, because many of those women have never had their strengths recognized in their entire lives, though they have them. They have survived, sometimes against all odds. So to recognize people's strengths, to build people's strengths, to help people, strengthen themselves in other areas where perhaps they really flounder. These are not things that a punishment system does, right? A punishment system just actually reinforces the areas of greatest trouble and sort of withers people's areas of strength too often. That's one of the reasons, when I think about why Penn is important, Penn's commitment to prison writing. It has operated a prison writing program for decades, and their defense of incarcerated writers all over this country, not only in this country, all over the world, is really important, because that freedom to write, like the freedom of the mind, your freedom around habits of thought, the ability to think, to express your emotions, in a host of ways would be fantastic, but the freedom to write is actually one of the things you actually can do in prison. And that's where I think I always see the reasons to step up and think about these women and these girls as in their own words.
Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with all of you and with this panel. And I have a great number of things that I want to say that are jumbled in my head at once, so I'm not sure it'll come out in any kind of a coherent format. The thing about jails and prisons, actually, I want to back up a step. When I listened to this video, we were standing in the wings hearing this video. I was very moved, and I was very struck by this notion of the power of the pen, because, in my day-to-day business, I'm not a writer, but when I think about the handful of times in life that I feel that I've impacted the life of a young woman or a child or somebody that's incarcerated, it's been through the effectiveness of taking pen to paper, to saying, Your Honor, this is ridiculous. Under no circumstance should this young woman be in jail because of A, B, and C. Or saying to a funding source, here is a brilliant way that one can do this, and won't you give this a try? And so these are things I think we'll get to later. Jennifer Gunnerman is a writer for The New Yorker, and she catalyzed a massive movement of justice reform with the simple power of bringing pen to paper, when in about 2.5 years ago, she wrote the story of a young man named Khalif Browder, a 16-year-old who came into Rikers Island having been charged with stealing a backpack, which he said he didn't, and his bail was set at $900. And he spent the subsequent 3 years in detention at Rikers Island, half of it in solitary confinement. Khalif's story is not an unusual one, sadly. And there are many girls and young women in the building next door to the building where Khalif was on Rikers Island, whose stories are so extraordinarily painful that sometimes I can't wrap my head around it, and you wonder. And yet they will sit together at the table and they'll talk and they'll sing and they will make the very best of the situation. The system is at its core the same inequities that have been inequities for women generally throughout the centuries are endemic to the justice system. The thing that's different now across the board is that there is a moment, this is a moment right now in criminal justice reform like none of us has ever seen. Those of us who have worked the work, those of us who have written the words. There has never been a moment like this in criminal justice reform. And so if there's an opportunity for young women and women to be able to begin to get back here, this is that moment. If there's a time when when policymakers and legislators are paying attention, this is that moment. And we gotta zoom in and we gotta do it while we can.
I just wanted to pick up on what Christine is saying about this moment, this opportunity that we currently have. I think that because most of my work has been both in outside of the U.S., but also in the U.S. On immigration detention. I think that one of the things that I've always been concerned about is not recognizing the sort of global linkages, particularly as it connects to incarcerated women globally. So that 50% uptick of incarcerated women in the United States also coincides with a global 50% increase of the incarceration of women that started happening right when neoliberal policy started to fail certain countries. So the connections for me between how women's labor, our abilities to produce or not produce, to provide for our families, are directly linked to this drive that the criminal justice system has done in terms of taking all of our social problems and putting them in prison, basically, right? I mean, and that's, I'm sure we'll talk about this more, so I'll keep it short.
I just wanted to echo, though, something that you said about the global ramifications. I had the opportunity last year to visit Canada a number of times, to visit Australia, and one of the things that you see so clearly is that the nations, particularly that share similar colonial histories, you see the exact same racial disparities, and they are often most acute among incarcerated women. So when you go up to Canada, you see overwhelming incarceration of Indigenous women in Canadian state and federal prisons. When you go to Australia, Indigenous people are 3% of the population in Australia. Fully 50% of incarcerated women in Australia are Indigenous women. And so, you know, there's a lot to unpack around all of the international, but the racial disparity and that history of colonialism and racial hierarchy is appalling and global, and not only here, but also shared.
So let's talk more about this moment that we're in, right? And both the opportunities and obstacles that you face in your work. You highlighted that this, you feel like, is a particularly key moment and for us to take advantage of. What are these trends, both nationally, locally, internationally, that you're seeing that either most excite you around reform opportunities or most worry you? So I'd like to throw that out there.
So I worry that we are moving globally into a swing back toward punishment and toward militarization, and that's frightening. So it's a really weird place to be right now, because there's so much that frightens me at the global level and the federal level, but so much that's encouraging me at the state and local levels. So I feel really schizophrenic sometimes. You know, should I be excited about the movement, or should I be scared to death that we're going where it's possible for us to go if we feed into some of the global and federal level rhetoric that we're hearing around punishment, about policing, privatizing prisons, sending police into poor communities with military equipment to, quote, clean them up, end quote. Those are the things that worry me. What encourages me, though, is the level of increased grassroots understanding that prisons are not the answer to our problems. In fact, in the United States, we can actually point to how our penchant for incarceration has made our problems worse over the last 40 years and not better. Those conversations are happening in more spaces. And grassroots advocates are taking more risk and asking for bigger wins, like closing Rikers, which would have been unheard of 5 years ago. But that also comes with a hope that those movements will be supported at the levels they need to be supported, and that folks who don't see this as part of what they need to care about understand the connections between everything that's happening around criminal justice reform, police, militarization of police at the national levels, the penchant for war talk. All of that impacts you at a very personal level when you can connect the dots. When you connect the dots to, healthcare, when you connect the dots to the intolerance of poverty, when you connect the dots to children wearing, ID bands to say that their parents didn't pay for their lunch. This is all the same thing. It's just that it shows up differently in different communities.
Okay, hi. I think for me, what I'm most concerned about right now would be something really specific, which goes to another question that you had asked, but I'll say it anyway, which is this recent Trump executive order, which basically encouraged and told ICE ICE officers that they could detain, they could increase the numbers of beds, increase the numbers of people who are detained in ICE facilities from, 30,000, which is really 40,000, to 80,000 a day. So, and this is something that DHS Kelly has not ruled out. In fact, he's very clear that this is, they're going to start rounding up. They're rounding up people in courts now, people who go in for non-criminal cases, which largely impact women. You cannot imagine what it is to go into a court thinking that you finally get to receive some form of justice against your perpetrator or something around your immigration hearing, something, and then to get picked up by an ICE agent with the help of local and state officers. So that's my biggest concern. I'm really concerned about what I'm seeing as being the extrajudicial or punishment and forced disappearances of immigrants in this country. Undocumented, excuse me.
I also see this sort of, these wild, contrasts that Vivian alludes to. I have visited, I think, 46 states in this country, and everywhere I go, there are people at the community level who are alert to the issues that are connected to the criminal justice system in new ways, people who are highly concerned and want to make change and are making change. And those issues, those folks are often focused on points of re-entry or points of prevention, right? Doing the work in the community to avoid having people go into the system. And so that's incredibly encouraging. And people are deeply informed sometimes and doing profoundly fabulous work. And that's great. What I see is that in places like New York City and some other, jurisdictions, which might be blue, you see an increased commitment to things like alternatives to incarceration or alternatives to conviction, diversion programs, things that are focusing on the front end of the system to have fewer children, fewer women, fewer men go into the system, and that's great. I hear a lot of rhetoric around kinder, gentler approaches around drug policy, and I'm deeply, deeply skeptical about that. I think we do see more thoughtful public health-based approaches in some places, and sometimes, some of the most populous places in the United States. But I live in Ohio, and what I see in the middle of the country and in many other places is increased prosecutions of people who are drug sellers at, homicide prosecutions when one of their customers overdoses. I see increased prosecution of drug-addicted mothers for child endangerment and sometimes for shockingly totally insane offenses around pregnant mothers who might be drug addicted. And so I see that harsh punishment playing out, including in a drug policy context, in a way that I sometimes feel like some of the rhetoric and discussion that we're having is like, oh, that ship has sailed, we're doing things better everywhere. But I see very, very harsh prosecutions coming out of a number of places in this country. And so, you know, who gets a better quality of justice in this country is, you know, always a discussion point. You know, we have a system where some people's, you know, safety and freedom is privileged over other people's safety and freedom in quite literal ways. Some people are afforded more safety and freedom at the expense of other people. And that's something that concerns me, and I think that's something we have not figured out, because there are places in this country that are neither safe nor free. And I think that the movements of law enforcement are not doing anything to make those communities safer or freer.
So I concur with everything my colleagues have said, and it's very difficult to always be striking a balance between when things seem to be going terribly well in a particular area, when in fact sort of the cloud around it is not so much going well. I think Vivian's term schizophrenic is really just spot on. Sometimes you want to hold your breath and close your eyes and think it's going to go away when you open them, but it doesn't. Some context that I think might be relevant is the organization that I'm with has worked with young people coming off of Rikers Island for going on 30 years. And so that experience has given us a pretty good understanding of some very interesting facts that go to your question. So in 1990, sort of at the height of the crack years, at the height of the how quickly can we build more jail years, on any given night on Rikers Island, there were about 23,000 people every night. Rikers is actually, it's literally, for those of you who might not know, it's an island in the East River, and on this island there are about 14 buildings, give or take, and each building houses a different category of person. And 27 years ago, there were 23,000 people there. Tonight, it's a number like 8,000. So this is a very good thing. In one of those buildings, the city has always housed people who are women and girls who are ages 16 and older in one building, whether they are detained or whether they are sentenced. That number, as an absolute number, has also dramatically declined. And so we've seen the census do this. So this is a very good thing. What is happening now locally with the initiative to close Rikers, the city has verbalized and articulated a commitment to do it. The Lippman Commission has articulated in a very, very smart way, very laid out way, here's a way you can close this down. You can cut this population in half through a series of initiatives. And once you've done that, then the number is low enough so that people don't need to be torn away from their communities, so that we have adequate jail space to put people who we, the city, determine need to be there. The fact is that as many places as we have to put people, the knee-jerk reaction will be if there's a cell to fill, the cell will get filled. So the thing that I worry about is an experience that the city saw in a much smaller microcosm. I forget what the years were, I'm going to guess in the early 90s. There was a juvenile detention center known as Spofford. It was the equivalent of for children that Rikers is for people 16 and older. And there was a massive effort to shut that institution down. And on any given night, it held kids between the ages of actually 12 and 15 in this one building in the South Bronx. And it began to be shut down during the Dinkins administration, and it was this close as two other smaller places in the community were opened. And then there was an election, and Giuliani won that election. And within 18 months, not only was Spofford at maximum capacity, combined with the two juvenile justice facilities at their capacity, But there was a barge that I'm not quite sure who we bought it from. I think it was during the Falklands War. This boat got left over. That's sitting in the East River, and that got filled with kids. So with reform comes a responsibility to not backslide. And I have to say that, you know, when I put on my pink rosy glasses, I think we're going to be better this time. But I think we have to be careful. And the last point I just want to make on this that worries me a little. All of a sudden, everybody believes in criminal justice reform. People who are legislators and people who are policymakers. And so now everybody is starting to throw money at this problem. Everybody's saying, we need more bail initiatives. We need more things here. We need more things here. I am concerned that unless we coordinate this initiative, that we're going to make a bigger problem. But so far, we're good.
So let's talk about, you know, you mentioned a local example of how a local election affected, you know, plans on the ground. And I had warned you that I, you know, wanted to ask a specific question around how our federal election in November may have changed your work, you know, how you think about the work, the resources available for your work. So why don't you just talk a little bit more about that, if you want to talk about sort of personal effects as well, I think that would be interesting. Yeah.
Specifically to the federal issue, from the perspective of the small nonprofit, you know, you worry first and foremost, is that federal grant going to get cut and when? And then at a kid level, at an individual level, at a person that you're working with level, one of the things that's just, it's sort of eating your heart away now is, you know, there was a time when if a person pled guilty to a particular offense and he or she happened to be not a citizen, then that conviction would result in the potential for deportation. Now it's so much worse than that, which seemed to be pretty much horrible enough. Now, when the issue is arisen, the entire family, the entire group surrounding that youth, in our case, we work with young people, and if she has a mother and a grandmother and a godmother and all but one of them are not citizens and her involvement in the justice system has brought something to the radar, boom, they're all looking at deportation. And we've seen this happen just in the last month, twice. So that's pretty stunning.
Any other thoughts?
Can I just add to that quickly? Because one of the things that you were saying about criminal justice reform, being skeptical of that, I mean, I think that I'm also concerned because there are potentials for all of these quote-unquote alternatives to widen the net of criminality or of contact, custodial contact, etc. And I'm thinking about this, I don't know this well because this affected my parents, actually, who were both incarcerated. In the 1970s and prior, we had some notion, some form of alternatives to alternatives to criminalization, alternatives to incarceration. And I remember this directly impacting my family. My father was in federal prison. My mother went away on the weekends until she served one minor bid and then ended up, getting rearrested for something else. But it put her in the system in a way. It put her in a system in the way that would greatly impact the lives of all of us. One more thing. Around the immigration detention, I think that what's happening now, which is also another concern of mine, is that if you have 65% of immigrants who are being, undocumented immigrants who are being held in ICE facilities are private. And when you think about mothers being separated from their children and not being able to stay with their families, this potentially increases the rate of mothers being deported, children staying in the U.S. on their own, and it creates a whole vacuum, a whole problem to which we don't have anything in place. We have absolutely no experience with this level of mass incarceration of immigrants and families.
One of the things I worry about with the change in the way that we're operating at the federal level, besides the funding streams, which, you know, the way the funding streams from the federal government work is there's an initiative, and in this case, one of the most pertinent initiatives is the Second Chance Act that was actually passed under the Bush administration, which has put money into states and communities to actually do these diversion programs or re-entry programs, education programs, labor programs. And those requests for proposals come down through a process, through the Department of Justice. And they're just not issuing the RFPs. So programs that have been up and running for years are now wondering, are the RFPs ever going to be issued? They're usually already issued by now. I have a program at my organization that's going to have to be cut June 30th if the RFP doesn't come out. So all of the women that we work with at Taconic facility and the Bedford Hills facility, trying to connect them to education, won't have that resource anymore. But I also worry about the seeming inability for the administration at the federal level to listen to anybody who knows anything. And I mean, I like to say things pretty plain. So during the immediate past administration, there were a group of us who had direct experience with incarceration, who had monthly phone calls with the Federal Interagency Reentry Council. That was developed by the Attorney General's office under Eric Holder to bring together the heads of all of the federal agencies to figure out what part they could play in reducing the numbers of people going into prison and reducing the numbers of people returning to prison and cycling in and out due to, and you know, quite frankly, they were focused on nonviolent crimes. That's not my approach, but that's what they were focused on. So they not only talked to us every month and said, tell us what your experience was like in prison, before you went to prison, when you got home. They invited us down to their monthly meetings at least twice during the administration. And then they supported us when we had town hall type meetings in 4 regions across the United States, where members of the federal government came and listened to a room full of formerly incarcerated people and their families to hear what the problems look like on the ground. I don't see that happening in this administration. And that lack of dialogue, that lack of really seeing what the problem is, scares me, because it reminds me of the days when people would invent the myths, like the Willie Horton myth, the super predator myth, the welfare queen myth. I'm worried about that all coming back.
Yeah, I mean that's the strength of particularly the presidency, is the ability to frame an issue and tell a powerful story. And whatever else you might think about our current president, he does have the ability to tell a powerful story, right? Again, you know, what we know from being out in the community all over this country is that people see what's happening in their communities and understand it a certain way. But the work that's been done really for decades, you know, whether you're talking about the work that you've been doing here in New York or, you know, the work that was done by the prior administration, helped to shift the way that people were thinking and talking about, you know, about crime, about disorder, about safety, about, you know, people, about the people in the system or the people who are affected by the system. So that's, to me, the biggest danger of the current federal regime, is that ability to shape and guide the narrative in a significant way. I think there is a sizable resistance. I will say, my observation, I was incarcerated in 2004, you know, I got out, I spent some time out now. Over time, what I started to see was that more and more the people who operate the criminal justice system were hearing from so many quarters that they needed to think differently and do differently, and that begins to shift their actions to some extent. And I'm talking about, police, I'm talking about sheriff's departments, I'm talking about prosecutors, I'm talking about judges, I'm talking about probation officers. So one of the dangers of the current administration is that there is license and encouragement to think in ways that we know, are frankly not fruitful or productive. I have to return, though, to the optimism I feel about what's happening at the local level and the simple fact that the vast majority of criminal justice decisions do get made at the local level in terms of what is literally going to happen to people, real people on the ground. The decision makers who are most important, in terms of whether mass incarceration numbers will rise or fall, are those community level systems players. County level government, city level government, that's really where it's at. And so because there is so much organizing going on in this country, all over the place around multiple issues that most concern people, and because the work of the administration and really frankly all of the advocates prior to the last administration to connect the dots between education and the school to prison pipeline, between the healthcare system and substance use disorder and mental health issues, those dots have been connected. And so practitioners out in those areas are now starting to recognize that the overlaps of the criminal justice system are something that has to concern them if they want the things that are important to them to go forward.
I guess keeping on that slight moment of optimism and room for progress, we did want to talk a little bit about what more government and the nonprofit sector and philanthropy can do. As a member of philanthropy, we like to hear that feedback of where we're working and where we're not working and where we can do better. What sort of top level 1 or 2 recommendations would you give to these key decision makers in order to leverage what we know works and to see that progress move quicker? I appreciate everyone's bluntness on this topic.
Many people who have been advocating for change because they themselves have been incarcerated or they have parents who have been incarcerated or loved ones who have been incarcerated picked up this mantra, nothing about us without us, right? So this idea that the people who, as our friend Glenn says at Just Leadership USA, so much leadership around Rikers, the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So I would say any of those sort of institutional players have to think about not imposing, solutions or next steps or changes without the insight of the people who will give them, the most lived experience in terms of shaping good policy. And so, so often when you talk about these topics, you might get a panel discussion of a bunch of white guys in law enforcement, rather than a group of people who will give you a full 360 around a question.
It's a matter of approach, right? So you can have the mentality that if a community is broken down, like the urban communities and the rhetoric around urban communities, during this last election cycle is dangerous. But if there are problems in that community, you can approach it by saying, we're going to drive in there with the police and the military and fix your problem, which is beyond paternalistic. There are other political words for it, but again, who might be listening? Or organizing communities to solve their own problems. And I truly believe that when you organize communities to solve their own problems, they solve them. The second half of what Glenn says is people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but furthest from power and resources. If communities have the power or are able to recognize their own power and get the resources to fix their problems, they will. But what we've done in this country through very suspect processes is make sure that power is not equally distributed even by the vote. So by taking away the right to vote, of many citizens. In some states, once you have a felony conviction, you can never vote again. By redistricting and all of these, and by counting people in prison as though they're part of districts when they can't vote, all of these things are taking the power and resources away from the communities that would solve their own problems if they had access to those things.
Any other thoughts on recommendations? No? And so those are recommendations to sort of key decision makers, right? When we think about, you know, formal places of power. But I'm curious, what advice would you give to, say, your average citizen or a member of the audience who is really passionate about this, maybe for the first time, maybe never having taken any action? What sort of advice would you give them as a way to do something different or to make a small piece of change or a big piece of change?
I mean, it sort of tethers off of what Vivian said. I always encourage people to go into a jail or go into a prison or go to, you know, a youth center in a community that perhaps is sending a lot of kids into the juvenile justice system or, God forbid, the adult system. Like, go there, say, not what can I do, but what do you need? And, you know, try to figure out how your abilities and skills match the needs. And believe me, there's so much need. I always describe prisons and jails as a gaping maw of need. You have, you know, all the needs we've already touched on in terms of, you know, substance use, you know, mental health, etc. But people need somebody who will listen to them. People who need somebody who will help them play music. People who need somebody to, like, teach them, you know, formal ideas about art. You know, there's a lot of need, like, because those kinds of things have been often, you know, the sort of the ability to have those kind of intellectual or emotional or creative opportunities have often been, you know, when we think about how narrow people who end up in the criminal justice system's opportunities have been generally prior to incarceration. So the big thing that I would say is just go there and see what's really happening and listen. And it's just, I don't know for myself, I spend Monday in a men's prison, Friday in a women's prison. They're some of the most important hours of my week other than the time I spend with my own family, right? You know, my students have so much to say, to do. You know, the people who work there, you know, are a fascinating actual source of interest for me in a way that was never true when I was incarcerated. And, you know, not all prisons and jails make it easy to, like, just walk up in there. But, you know, those are public institutions. They belong to us. And, you know, you find, you know, the faith group or some other, you know, some other community-based organization that already has a foothold in there, and you can get in there. And that's the thing that, like, at that very local, individualized level, you know, if you've never set foot in a prison or jail, everyone should. Yeah, and not that sort of, like, the zoo tour that they like to take people on, but, like, some opportunity to sit in companionship and fellowship with the people who are living some part of their lives there is a really important thing.
And there are a couple of ways to go about that. So one way here in New York, you know, the thing that I think education is part of all of this, and how we educate people, including in the arts, and educating them about their place in the world beyond you need a job, right? That whole, and the reentry movement has been mostly about getting people jobs and not helping people be fully self-actualized through other types of education. Those of you who are in New York, if you want to get inside a prison just to see what is possible, just go to the Bard Prison Initiative website and sign up for their newsletter, and then send them a $10 donation so that you can get invited to their graduation. When they do a graduation in a correctional facility in New York, you get to see, talk to, and hear some of the most brilliant minds that I have ever met talk about what education has done for them. But unfortunately, the doors, prisons have gates for a reason. Unless you are actively involved in an initiative that's going on inside a prison or visiting a relative or friend, you're not going to get inside. And even if you're visiting a relative or friend, you're not going to want to keep going back because they treat you like crap. But if you go to a Bard Prison Initiative graduation, or a Hudson Link graduation, or the Marymount program at Bedford's graduation, they tend to make the space much more open so that you can actually have conversations with the people who are living in the prison and kind of dispel the myth of what many people think people who are in prison are like. Because it's nothing that you can imagine. It's not like the exploitative shows on television about prison. It's lock up or lock down. I don't watch them, so I don't really know the names. And it's also not like the news that you see when people in prison are portrayed, when there's some momentary crisis, right? Where somebody in prison escapes, or somebody in prison does something horrible, which is minuscule in the landscape of 2 million people incarcerated, and 6 million people in and out of jails every year, and 70 million people with criminal histories. They will take one news story and loop it over and over again until somehow we all believe that everybody who goes to prison is like that. We've, what Malcolm X used to say, you've been hoodwinked, you've been bamboozled. This is not what the truth is. And we can no longer rely on journalists in a large sense to be free enough, even in the corporations they work for, to tell the whole truth. So we have to be more inquisitive, and we have to read writing that is much more objective and fact-based, and stop getting our news from entertainment news. And that's why writing is so important. That's why the Pen Project is so important. The books that they've produced, that have been written and by people in prison, read them. Read those poems, read those stories. You'll get to know the population we're really talking about.
I was going to add, I don't know if Penn, you still take volunteers, right, for the prison project?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so that's another way. And also there's endisolation.org, I think, sets up visitations to detention centers locally, so anyone can sign up, anyone can go, and that's really important. And there was actually one thing I wanted to say, which was for all of my feminists in the audience. I would really love to see this issue be taken up as a feminist cause, because this is absolutely one of our most intersectional of issues. I mean, everything that you could possibly imagine, climate change too, it really comes down to the incarceration of women and how we need to change this system. We absolutely need to change it and abolish it. Sorry, that's not
Do you have any thoughts or advice?
I brought a poem that I want to read. Can I do that?
Yeah.
Because it's much more intelligent than anything I might add to everything I've already said. This is on the wall of our office. It was written by a 17-year-old girl when she turned 18 and came and we were working with her. I remember not getting letters. I remember watching commercials of food that made my mouth water, and all I could do was close my eyes and pretend I was eating what I had just seen. I used to pretend that it tasted like Big Mac in the commercials. And for dessert, Frosted Flakes, vanilla wafers, and blueberry muffin, all crushed up inside a milk carton with milk. It tasted like a flurry. I remember making a scarf out of my pillowcase. I remember the moldy smell of decay, depression, disownment, and death, and the rats running from cell to cell, and roaches that would come up out of the sink. I know there's more to life than robberies and nosebleeds. I know the ones that love me are disappointed in me, because they never thought they would see me in a cage. They see the rage that's burning within me. Sitting in the plastic chair, covered in a triple extra large Velcro jumper, they're a mess, with stress written all over my face. The devil is testing me. God is testing me. I'm trying to be that lotus flower behind the crack house. I've learned never to regret what I've done, but to take it as a learning experience and grow from it, and never let it happen again. I take every bad experience as a stepping stone that makes me wiser for the future, for the next path in my journey in life. My physical may be trapped, but my mental flies to places that only minds can go and only minds can understand. I go to a place in my heart that helps me fly. I fly even when I cry. I am a woman of power, a woman of sincerity, a woman who knows how it is to be incarcerated. I am a woman that knows how it feels to be verbally, physically, mentally abused. I am strong. I am beautiful.
Well, with that, and a very clear example of the power of words, I'd like to turn it over to the audience to see if we have any questions for our panelists.
Can we bring up the lights?
Yeah.
A little bit.
And the mic is over here.
Thank you all for your thoughts. I'm wondering, based on some of the things you've mentioned, it seems the profit sort of motive may present a challenge to solving the problem. So can any of you speak to how you see that working out?
Yeah. I'll start and then I'll turn it over. So yeah, huge, actually the biggest problem, right? It's the biggest obstacle. So you hear all this rhetoric, you hear all this agreement from many, many different, players, like, yeah, what we're doing doesn't work at all, and yet, they still are prosecuting, drug-addicted mothers and piling on additional charges. So when you build the world's biggest carceral state, the biggest prison population in human history, more of our own citizens and other people incarcerated than any society has ever done, people start to draw a lot of benefit from it. So private prison corporations are the most obvious, bad actors, and many Americans sort of didn't even know that was a thing until, this decade. But there's all kinds of benefit, and so correctional guards unions, correctional officers unions are often held up as particularly bad actors. I'm reluctant to slam organized labor, but there's literal financial profit, which again, Aramark, if you ever go to a stadium and buy like stadium food, just know that your provider is also providing food in most prisons, or many, many, many prisons and jails all over this country. But there's also a more intangible benefit, right? Like the power of a prosecutor. Like a prosecutor is a powerful person. And so like personal power is a benefit as well. And so actually, literally the most intransigent opponent to reform has been the prosecutor community. And that's not about financial power, that's about personal power, right? So yes, so the benefit that people draw from the existing system is a very substantial barrier. And so that's the thing that we really have to sort of dismantle. Part of it involves things like labor strategies. And there's been work actually from reform people to engage organized labor, to start to think about like how can we remove that impediment in terms of the many, many unionized people who work in prisons and jails and those labor unions' responsibility to protect them as workers, right? But some of those other things, like particularly some of the entrenched power around the bench and around the role of prosecutors, that is going to require a lot more organizing, engagement, thought. There is this fundamental issue around the fact that the legal system itself, our law itself, is built in part from building blocks of colonialism and racism. And so what are we going to do about that, right? Those are substantial challenges as well. But that profit motive, when we look at a private prison corporation, it stinks to high heaven, but there's a broader question.
Yeah, and I want to just be a little more specific for those who don't live in in the
in
world
my
we
head.
live in, right? So, because we talk about this stuff all the time. If we're going to judge prosecutors by how many people they lock up, that is not a measure of public safety. That's a measure of how many people a prosecutor can scare to death to say, if you don't take this plea, you're going to spend 10 years in prison. So people take pleas, the number of prosecutions go up, the prosecutor looks like he's doing a great job. Meanwhile, it's not doing anything to increase public safety. The margin of investment in prosecution as compared to the margin of investment in defense for people who have no money, I don't know what the numbers are, but I know they're like this. We spend at least 50 times more on prosecution than we spend on public defense for people who have no money. It's not a fair system. People are not judged, are not considered innocent until they're proven guilty. Anytime you heard the Khalif Browder story, a 16-year-old can spend 3 years on Rikers Island, half of which was in solitary confinement, and never had been convicted of anything. There's nothing fair about that. And we've got to start standing up about that. So the profit motives go far beyond money. It goes to re-election, it goes to power, it goes to how we measure success in the system. If prosecutors were measured by, you'll be more successful, Mr. Prosecutor, if people really get speedy and fair trials, then we'd have a different result because their motive would be different.
So first I want to say thank you to everyone on the panel. You are all incredibly inspiring to me. And my question is in the context of trying to be an activist who's careening between those poles of hope and fear, and the issue of reform being co-opted, because I am a member of an organization called JFRED, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and we recently held a Passover Seder in the streets at City Hall and then at Foley Square to demand that Mayor de Blasio support the Right to Know Act, which is a very important local proposed legislation to erode broken windows policing, to make the police disclose who they actually are, to hold them accountable. But, and it was a wonderful, inspiring event for me, but the fear part of it for me is that there is a debate going on about whether we should reform policing or visualize a society where safety is something other than having a police force at all. Because one of the things that I've read about the history of having police forces in the United States is that it is rooted in slavery and that it started with slave catchers. So I'm wondering, in terms of immediate and long-term visions, what your thought about policing as an institution is.
Who would like to take that?
Can I just say quickly that I love JFRIDGE. You all helped me radicalize when I was in college. Okay, policing, wow. I'll just say one thing. I think that I don't know how to answer this except for to say that one of my hopes is that what we can do is build on our dreams and try to create and demand a society that looks just and fair. And if that means, with any luck, the abolition of a police state, of police forces, then absolutely, I think these are the things that we should be demanding. I don't know how we do that, but I'm going to meet with you afterwards so we can talk about how we can do it.
And I just have one sentence, because I can almost feel whenever someone brings up the possibility of a world without a police state or without prisons, I can almost feel the people going, yeah, right, that's not going to happen. Like, we need the police because we've always had them. But I want to let you know we haven't always had them. And, you know, the native people of this land didn't even have words for the stuff we do. There was no word in their language for the type of violence that they experienced when the first settlers came here. They couldn't comprehend it because they didn't have a language for it. So it is possible for societies to live without state violence against its own citizens.
The advice I would give, I mean, the sort of like, the hope and fear thing is hard, but you know, the fear, around fear, I think it's just important to be in community with people who share your sort of broad vision for a more equitable, you know, society and community. And so like, for people who want to do the work to go back and to be in community, whatever that looks like for you, is really important. I'm a very pragmatic person, like, so when I think about something like advocating for abolition, I'm always like, well, you know, how could that not be pie in the sky? So, for example, you want to put your energy into abolition, I would say go whole hog at the abolition of juvenile prisons, because we can do that, right? That is something that I think is eminently doable, and I mean, you know, no one was talking about closing Rikers 10 years ago. So when I think about that, you know, the idea of prison abolition, like, how could we start to put that in practice? How could we show skeptics that that's possible? Well, one thing we could absolutely do is abolish juvie prisons. No prison for children, right? So like, I'm just like, do it, like, what can we do, right? Think about, you know, the most realistic thing and go for that.
Any other thoughts? Okay, next question.
Hi, thank you guys, this was great. I have a question that builds a little bit off of Kate's last question. She asked you guys for advice for decision makers and for citizens. And I work for an organization that works at the nexus of a large community of donors. So I wondered if you had any specific advice for donors. And I know, Christine, you mentioned earlier you bring ideas to funders. So any advice for donors would be really appreciated.
Do you mean individual rich people?
Across the board, rich people, foundations, corporate, all of the above. We work with all of them.
Any organization that does what Vivian's organization does or ours does needs an individual personal sugar daddy. Everybody, that's first and foremost, so that no one has to run around figuring out whether they can make payroll. I think that one of the things in our world that has always been true is there's a limit to a number of private foundations and corporations that fund in our world. I mean, you'll have this much that funds all the other stuff and this much that funds the work that we do.
Historically, actually, it's only been 2% of philanthropy. I think it has increased a little bit, actually, in just the last few years, but 5 years ago, it was just 2% of institutional philanthropy.
So to the extent that what we do and what our work teaches us can inform in turn people who have either access to wealth or donors who are looking for opportunities to invest in different areas. Again, it comes to the voices of the people who are working in the jails and in the prisons and in the juvenile justice centers and in the street to say, these are the circumstances. You know, next week I'm taking 2 funders. It makes me feel all icky when I say this, but I'm taking funders to Rikers Island. I want them to see what we do with the young people that we work with, and I want them to understand, sort of see and feel for themselves a little bit what it feels like. And, you know, I don't know how impactful it is, but in the past when I've done that, it does make a difference. It just sort of, if I'm allowed to say a bad word, you get sort of a holy shit response. And then, you know, and it begins from there. Because a lot of people just don't know, unless you do this work, or unless you've had the experience directly of being inside. You can't know. And so that's one way. But I also wonder sometimes whether, you know, there are whole hosts of organizations, private companies that assist families of wealth in trying to figure out how they might direct their philanthropy. And that's a place that I certainly have no inroads into that world, and I suspect many of our sister nonprofits that do this work don't either. But that's an area that's, I think, ripe for maybe looking and seeing, because it lends itself to zeroing in on a very specific, heartfelt cause that actually has the potential for impact. So.
Can I add to that? Because I think that one of the issues is that, especially for the private family firms, I think that if changing the discourse of failure around people who have been incarcerated, changing that perception, as both Vivian and Piper have mentioned, focusing in on people's potential, and that's going to be the job of people who are managing these folks. But, and then connecting them to organizations who are on the ground doing the work. Because this is, again, for me, fundamentally one of the most important issues that touches upon every aspect of our lives, even when we think that we are not directly connected. So,
And I want to add, this is a very particularly sensitive area for me, because as an executive director of a really small organization, I spend a lot of time fundraising. And at every level, whether it's family foundations or huge foundations, there's not a high tolerance for risk or for funding things that aren't in vogue or that may take away from the tradition of that institution. So, for instance, a huge foundation that loves to, I'm not going to say a name. Huge foundations that fund education all over the country will give millions of dollars to Columbia, to Yale, to Harvard, organizations that already have their own money. Like, they have their own money, trust me. They have huge endowments. But foundations will continue to give them money when organizations like ours, there are actual days when I have to make a phone call because I'm not sure I'm going to make payroll. And I'm sure that's not happening at these huge universities, but philanthropy loves funding that kind of stuff. Not that universities shouldn't be funded, that's not what I'm saying at all. Not that the arts shouldn't be funded, but take a look at where capacity needs to be developed and be willing to help people develop capacity. The second thing I want to say is, again, don't come in and tell us what you're going to give us. Come in and ask us what we need.
Yeah, there's an irony to what Vivian has to say, because many people would say the role of philanthropy is to fund innovation and to look for the better way and to fund risk, right? Like that's something that we can't necessarily count on the government to do, for example. We can't count on the federal government to do anything other than incarcerate us now, but I would say this about both institutional philanthropy and individual donors is to point out the overlaps of the things they already care about. So LGBTQ youth are more likely to be criminalized and to be incarcerated than non-LGBTQ youth. And actually non-gender conforming girls are the most likely, right? If folks, many people in that world that you described care about substance use disorder and mental health issues, and that's where, we have enshrined medical care for those issues for poor people in the criminal justice system. That's where we're going with this. So the things that those donors already care about are completely impacted by the criminal justice system. They just may not recognize those things. The other thing that I would say to any donor, but also to any human being, you don't have to be a rich person, is that your investment, whether it's of money or of time and energy, whether you're investing in an organization or whether you're investing your time going in and doing a literacy program, the yield on the time or the energy or the money that is invested here is tremendous. In other words, what I always say, when I talk to college students, I'm like, if you want to go make a difference in criminal justice, there's a huge opportunity for you to have an individual impact, right? It is not an area that is awash in money, like some other, well, not necessarily awash, but It's just a place where your energies can yield just an obvious improvement really quickly, whether again you're helping people learn to read, or doing anything that you might do on an individual level, and certainly on an investment level. So yeah.
Thanks. I was saying we have time for one more? Okay.
Hi, I'm Gigi. Thanks for coming and talking today. I facilitate writing workshops at Rikers actually for youth and young adults. So however you've been an inspiration for the workshopping, and also as somebody who's formerly incarcerated, I write about that as well. On the units I teach at, I actually see flyers for Friends of the Academy. And I know it's really important for the youth, and I noticed that you guys have a prison to school pipeline mission, and I was hoping maybe you could talk about that, and if there's anything that maybe I might employ in my classes or as community members, how we could facilitate that as well.
It's so wonderful that you do that. That's so great. Do you do it on your own, or do you do it with an organization?
We're just the girl with the funding. I'm starting an
The girl with the
organization.
funding. Right there.
Where's the girl with the money?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm embarrassed to say this. What was the question?
If you could talk about the prison to school.
Oh, did you? Okay. It was something that we started, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago. We named it the Jail to School Pipeline. Everybody hears about the school to jail pipeline and how, you drop out of school and then the next thing that happens is you go to jail, or you get suspended, or you have attitude one day and the next thing you know you're in jail. So the notion here was to reverse the trend. Our organization has this bizarre name because in the 1980s, when we were busy locking up so many people, the Department of Education had to put a school on Rikers Island because on any given night there were almost 4,000 adolescents held there. And so through a combination of family advocacy and the threat of litigation, they put this school on Rikers Island, and the school was named Island Academy. Friends of Island Academy was the brainchild of the woman who was the first principal of that first school, who got together with a bunch of advocates inside and out, and it was a response to this cycle, which back then about 70% of young people were back within 1 year. Also a metric that has gone down. Well, that's another thing for the foundation people, this metric thing. We should talk about that. So the idea was that we would get to know young people while they were in school and leverage those relationships to try and pull them in when they came out. Because there was no court mandate in the sentence facility. When you're done and you're a kid and you come home, you're done. There's no thing called aftercare because that's not an adult criminal justice thing. So point being, the jail to school pipeline sought to reverse the trend. And so that program is no longer funded. However, we still have advocates every day, 6 days a week there, whose role it is in the 4 buildings where young people walk in, and Rosie's is one of them, where the girls are and the young women are, is to meet at the front door and say, hi, my name is Chris. How are you holding up? Is there something I can do for you? Is there somebody I can call for you? And that's within the first 24 hours of admission. And then we follow them while they're inside and hope and catch them and bring them in when they're outside. That's how that works. So there are, afterwards we can talk, so I can connect you to who our folks are on Rosie's. And also Ms. Tamia, the program counselor, she also knows who we are. So we could do that.
Well, that looks like our last question, and I'm being encouraged to wrap up. Before we do so, any final thoughts? We've asked a lot of questions here today that we're hoping to shine some light on these topics. Any questions that we may have missed? Questions that you do a lot of these panels, for example, and you're always waiting for somebody to ask, but they never ask. What are these questions that need to remain on the forefront of our minds as we move forward?
Well, I always like to remind audiences to think about and read about how much, especially in the American criminal justice system, race plays a part of this. The reason we were willing to lock up so many kids is because we literally don't see black children as children. We see them as threats. So I just always like to leave people with that thought. And the second is an apology that as soon as this is over, I need to run to a family event. But feel free to contact me if you want to have a conversation. I'm easy to find.
Any other final thoughts? No? Well, we just have to say thank you again for your time. It was a true treasure to have you here. Can we just give another round of applause for that panel? And just to echo Vivian's last comments, I love the synergy that was happening between the questions and some resources, et cetera. Please feel free to reach out to us, any of the work and organizations that we represent, and also hear from the New York Women's Foundation if you have any further thoughts for us on how we can be a responsive partner to community, to individuals on these issues. So thank you again, and thank you to the organizers.